Welcome, Protege. In the last tutorial, we gave you a brief overview of the different conditional statements that MATLAB has to offer. In this tutorial, we're going to cover for loops more in depth. And as we mentioned, these are used for repetitive code. I already created a script called for loops and already added some boilerplate code. One thing that you want to get in the habit of doing is adding a brief description about what the code is doing. I usually like to add it at the first line of the code. That way you can quickly remember what this code is actually doing. Our first for loop is just going to use a row vector. So I'll quickly create a random row vector. I created a 1 by 20 row vector. And next we're going to create a for loop to calculate the sum of all the elements in this row vector. I know that there's a high-level function called sum where it can easily calculate the sum of the row for you, but I just want to show a simple example so you can get the hang of for loops. And remember how I mentioned that you want to try to make your code as modular as possible instead of hard coding everything. So this ending integer needs to be the number of elements in your row, or to find that number you simply use the length function. If we go back and change the dimensions of this row vector from 20 to say 30, then our for loop will go from 1 to 30. But if we hard coded it to say 20, then we would have to go back here and keep changing that every time we changed our row vector. Next, I'm going to use a function to display our counting variable to the command window, and that function is disp, short for display. I'm going to say I equals and then comma, and then you want to pass in the variable that you want to print after this equal sign, which is I. But we have to convert I to a string to be able to print it to the screen. And there's a high-level function called num to string. And this function will take I and convert it to the string variable. And next we're going to calculate the sum. So we need a variable for that. I'm just going to say sum1d equals row vect of I. And this will not work as it stands, because every time we go into this loop, sum1d will just get set to its respective element. So for example, the first time we go into this loop, I will equal 1. So we index into row vect of 1 and set that equal to sum of 1d. But when we go to the second iteration, I equals 2, we will index into row vect of 2, and that sum will get set to this element, but doesn't get added to the first element. And how do we do that? Well, just use the same variable there, and now it will keep the previous sum and add it to the next element in the row vector. And now that we have sum1d, we need to go back to our variable declaration section and set that equal to 0, because if we don't, then we'll get an error saying that sum1d doesn't exist. Don't forget to terminate your for loop with this end. Another thing you want to get in the habit of doing is debugging your code periodically. I have two more for loop examples that I want to show you, but before I go to those, I want to go ahead and debug this piece of code. That way it's easier to pinpoint exactly where an error is if we do end up getting one. But if we keep writing code without debugging it periodically, then we'll have this very long script and it will be much more difficult to debug. Go ahead and run this piece of code. Looks like we did get an error, so we can easily pinpoint where that is. It's on line 14. We go back to line 14. Looks like I forgot a square bracket. Go ahead and run that again. And we didn't get the infamous ding, so we know that it was successful. And notice that we were able to display our counter variable. If you wanted to display this sum variable, you can do that as well, just to see the sum change with each iteration of the loop. So I'm just going to copy our display function and modify that. And instead of passing I into there, we want to pass in our sum 1D variable. Go ahead and run that. And now we can look at the sum after each iteration. So for example, the first iteration, our sum is 82. I'll show the elements of the row vector. Sum is 82 after the first iteration. Then the second iteration, we add 398 to 82 to get 480, and so on. Now that we know that that works, we can move on to the next example. And I'm just going to comment out these displays so they don't keep outputting to the screen and we don't have to wait for all the values to display, because displaying to the command window takes a long time. For a quick recap, we went more in depth into for loops. We showed you how to iterate through elements of a row vector or a 1D matrix. We showed you how to display the counter variable on the command window. We showed you how to use num2string to convert our counter variable to a string to be able to output to the command window. And we showed you how to iterate through each element of the row vector to calculate the sum of that row vector. In the next tutorials, we'll show you how to iterate through a 2D matrix and a 3D matrix. That's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe below or leave a question or comment.